Hello and welcome to Insurgency Podcast. I'm Nikolas Kosmatopoulos. I'm Associate Professor of Politics and Anthropology at the American University of Beirut and member of the Critical Ecologies Lab in the Mediterranean East. I'm the host of this podcast that is made possible through a grant by the URB at AUB. And we also are grateful to the AUB team who's behind the cameras and in this studio at the Assam Forest Institute at AUB. The podcast Insurgency wants to explore the world oceans from a global south perspective. We look at communities, indigenous communities rising to challenges facing them, their livelihoods, their future, and also their ecologies. We look at communities that are crisscrossing the sea, that are using the sea to reclaim their rights, reclaim their territories, reclaim their economies and their ecologies. And we look at communities that are embarking on the sea to rethink histories of empire, histories of colonialism, and resistance to the imperial system. Today we have the joy and the pleasure to have with us one acclaimed historian of the empire and good friend, Professor Blumi. Aissa is a professor of history and Ottoman studies in the University of Stockholm, and he has been actually writing some very influential books about Yemen in particular, but not only. Aissa has been actually extremely global in his writings. He has been writing about the Balkans, about the Middle East, about the Yemen, as we said, today and in the past. But his most influential actually books about Yemen are the book published by California University Press, Destroying Yemen in 2018, and before that, Chaos in Yemen in 2010. He has also a special issue forthcoming in the Middle East Critique on Yemen. So I don't think there is a better person to talk about what's happening in Yemen these days than Aissa Blumi. Aissa, welcome to Insurgency Podcast. We are very happy and excited to have you on board. It's wonderful to talk to you about not very wonderful things happening actually in Yemen. We hope to be able, however, to push back against the dominant misrepresentations about the events in Yemen. So welcome you to the podcast with the question about, give us a sense of what's happening today in Yemen, especially in the sea around Yemen, in Bab el-Mandab and the South Red Sea.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be on your program, and it's a quite impressive group of colleagues you have working with you on this, and it's an initiative that, inshallah, will have a much broader audience than, say, progressive challenges to empire are generally allotted, simply not in mainstream media. And mainstream media and the so-called rebellious elements in the social media sphere are regularly misrepresenting events in the Red Sea, and especially regards to the very principled response of Yemenis since late 2023 to stand on what should be international legal grounds that has been embraced by every sovereign state required as signatories to the Geneva Convention and the United States UN Charter to no longer allow for sovereign entities or extra sovereign entities to conduct and wage a campaign of genocide. Unfortunately, with perhaps the exception on certain points of time in southern Lebanon, there has not been a concerted effort to actually address the ongoing genocide. International legal conventions have recognized it, even in if contested by sovereign states. And even though that Yemen itself is, or Yemenis are acting often in a confused context of not even being recognized representatives of what Yemen constitutes in the legal framework today, those who are administering over 20 million people under the coalition of Ansar Allah have, since the end of October 2023, stated explicitly that it is required as a people, as sovereign people, as human beings, to stop this genocide, this mass murder of innocent human beings who happen to share a common space in the imagination of Yemenis for many, many, many years. Principled position taken by Ansar Allah and the founding elements of a progressive Yemen, who have long stood in solidarity with Palestinians to secure a homeland that has been under siege since even before World War II. So the campaign that we call today, and usually framing it in terms that the Israelis, the Americans, and empire in general set, is an erroneous one. This is a principled gesture of resistance and intervention to stop genocide. It is not an extension of Iranian, Saudi, or Iranian American conflict. This is actually first and foremost an intervention by a collective intervention by a people who share the Red Sea with the peoples under siege right now to stop it. And so that's what I can say is happening right now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I want to also at this stage thank our research assistant Ruwa Shakarun in this podcast, and I have with me also another student, Dina Al Amood, who is helping with the podcast. And Dina will also be asking some questions, especially about the historical work you've done. Because you mentioned exactly how erroneous, this misrepresentations are, and description of what's happening in Yemen. I want to dig a bit further in that. I mean, in your book, you start with exactly that, right? Saying how misrepresented Yemen has been, not only by media, right? I mean, there's a lot of manipulative reporting, you call it. For example, when media are calling what's happening in Yemen the last, since 2018 at least, a civil war. But also social scientists have misdescribed Yemen as backwards, tribalist, the Houthis, we keep listening to that and name, of course, as a way to put them back in the tribal corner, right? At the same time, I think so I would like you to comment a bit on these misnomers that we hear this time again, especially because they are in the frontline news, but mainly also if you can about the other thing you definitely defend very well in your book about how central Yemen is to global affairs. Like Yemen it's historically but also geopolitically extremely centered around the histories of empire, the history actually of the globe, right? Not only because of the people that came from Yemen, Arabic also to a great extent came from Yemen, but also how Yemen can shake the making of worlds, right, in the past and also today. So would you like to comment on that?
That's a mouthful, Nikolas, but I will try my best, because indeed the very reason why Ansar Allah has emerged over the course of this transitional period of the modern unified state of Yemen, which was only unified in 1990 and has been functionally disaggregated again by empire, as they did with Syria and Iraq and Libya and Palestine and more generally. But the case of Yemenis responding to these collective pressures from vested interests in the outside world to open up Yemen's ecology, economy, and more importantly, to address the constant pushback from the peoples of Southern Arabia in face of global capitalist imperialism that has slowly but surely incrementally made its way as a presence in the lives of people of Southern Arabia. mostly by interjecting and interfering with yet southern or Arabian people's ability to continue with cultural, economic, political exchanges with the outside world. Yemenis are quite self-sufficient, but they're also global in perspective. And this is something we want to highlight, that the infringements that have been introduced in the Indian Ocean world directly, physically onto the peninsula of Arabia are necessarily demand Yemeni responses in ways that have been quite innovative over the course of the last 250 years, and actually helped, as I argued in one of my works, Foundations of Modernity, actually shaped the contours of what we would identify as the modern state itself. Empire itself is a reflection on the capacity of peoples like those in Yemen, like those in the Levant, to resist the encroachments of global capitalism by way of colonialism or by way of proxy comprador class of intermediaries locally. And so Yemenis have articulated often in solidarity, often in union with those who have been resisting from the larger global south, also in solidarity of those who were fighting within empire in the form of unionism, labor unionism. We often find Yemenis at the forefront of labor union active in Europe, in Britain, in the United States, which is an interesting side story to all this. But the very fact that Ansarullah emerges as a coalition of disparate political parties, of movements that had all collectively articulated over the last 50 years in the course of the Cold War, a critique of global capitalism, and a critique of the Cold War and how empire, as it was modifying over the course of these 60, 70 years, directly impacted the lives of peoples in Southern Arabia, who elected at certain points of time to form broader political coalitions in the form of a modern nation state, in the form of some kind of amalgamation that has long been mischaracterized in the nomenclature of Middle East studies, which has been critiqued by sophisticated scholars in the post-colonial kind of realm, if you will, as Orientalist, as producing degenerative, ahistorical characters, where in fact Yemenis have been at the forefront of determining the extent to which we can talk about the Middle East in new ways.
Yeah,
and so
this is an amazing
yes.
thing with your argument that the Yemenis are in fact at the forefront. They are not at all at the margins. They are maybe at the margins of our maps, but they will have to rethink our maps, right? I mean, we have definitely to redo our maps, and this is what you are arguing for. So Yemen is much more central. Yemen.
And just put it as a metaphor, perhaps, of their ability to deliver supersonic missiles now that they've engineered themselves. And this is completely challenges how the whole context in which the world interacts with Yemen as an Iranian proxy, or as, again, a tribal backward society that is stuck in medieval ways. And yet here is these so-called medieval tribalist peoples who are basically at the beck and call of Iran, conducting things completely independent of Iran, which has its own kind of political problems these days, let alone technologically beating modern capitalist military-industrial complex. It just fired a missile to Ben Gurion Airport, and the most expensive, elaborate anti-missile defense systems that the Americans and empire could produce could not stop it.
Yep.
And this missile is produced by these backward, cave-dwelling peoples, supposedly, again, who have been reduced by not only pundits of empire, but the academics who work for empire, who have regularly dispossessed the peoples of Yemen a place in the modern world. And the consequences are shocking to the likes of Donald Trump's team or the Obama Clinton team.
You mean the consequences of the missile, right? Of the
consequences of
Yemen's actions, yeah.
the misunderstanding, this is the kind of critique we have of
Miscalculation, rather. Yeah.
the racism that is embedded in how we look at the world. And it's often appropriated, by the way, by people inside the Middle East, right?
Yeah.
We have a lot of
Yeah.
people in the Middle East who harbor this discourse about Yemenis as backward people, and they can't understand how suddenly this very principled people who are not integrated into our shopping mall kind of culture are the only ones who are resisting on principle the powers of empire. Our societies are otherwise incapable of doing that. So this is yes.
Can I jump in, because you just
Sure.
said something that I really want to expand further. The point about how Yemenis are at the forefront are in fact extremely also sophisticated, in the technologies, and they also in the civilizational understanding and the solidarity. How does the sea feature into that? Does the sea play a role? Especially because they were always at the more central roots, and that humanity has been trading, or that connecting humanity since ancient times. Do you see the sea part of that story that you're telling?
Absolutely. The more concurrent issues, of course, is they initiated an embargo on any trade going to Israel. Any shipping that would go and be destined for Eilat or for the Suez Canal and then dock in Haifa would be blocked. So the sea itself is a means to putting up a barrier to resupply a genocidal regime or in a genocidal campaign. So the sea in itself, which is a necessary conduit for resupplying a genocidal modern state, apartheid colonialist state, is a tool that can be used to block such efforts. Now, this is one of the campaigns of misrepresentation, of course, where much of the media sells this intervention, a bombing of Yemenis today as Yemenis are somehow infringing on freedom of trade in the open seas, which is not the case at all. There are still ships that pass through the Red Sea, increasingly less so, ironically enough, because the Americans have initiated this military campaign against Yemenis. Again, under the guise, false claim of that the Yemenis are blocking trade in general, which they are explicitly, many times, represented their campaign to stop trade with Israel, not allowing resupply of a genocidal campaign, which is a requirement of all sovereign states who are signatories to the Geneva Convention and the UN Charter. So the sea is an important tool to try to stop the genocidal campaigns of the Zionist colonialist enterprise.
For sure, yeah, but I'm talking about also historically, how does that have played a role?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is where Dina would like to ask you more questions, but you can go ahead with this, and then we're going to go back to your work. So, yeah,
but sadly,
how do you see this connection? That would be great.
Yeah. Sadly, the campaign to destroy Yemen has also utilized the sea as a weapon. The full-on embargo that has been imposed on Yemen since 2015, if not a little earlier, made it impossible for the 20+ million people who live under the administration of Ansar Allah to actually have free access to the outside world. So that in many ways, ironically, that has forced Yemenis to be that much more innovative, that much more in a self-preservation mode, actually developing their own technology to, one, conduct a war of self-defense against this coalition that empire put together in 2015 to reverse a domestic political struggle for authority, and then the use of this sea embargo to starve civilians into submission, to induce conflict within Yemeni society. The idea is that we're going to punish economically Yemenis for not overthrowing this coalition put together. It's very much akin to what Lebanese have often experienced, and what, of course, in Palestine has long been used as a tool, creating divisions within society, denying people even the ability to feed themselves. And that has basically done, ironically, in the case of Yemen, is that it's reversed their economic and material relationship with the outside world. Due to this corrupt regimes that until 2014 actually administered Yemen since the late 1970s, Yemen had become globally integrated into this neoliberal economic model, and a country that once was able to feed itself was importing 90% of its food. The irony is that the idea was to use this as leverage against Yemenis to politically shape them in the future. Where the fact that Yemenis have now reversed that relationship, they are now producing their own food again. Just last year, in Ansar Allah's territories, they produced a surplus of wheat. Mashallah. So, despite the fact that they've been under embargo, that their infrastructure has been bombed, that there has been a use of starvation as a tool of empire to subject these people to destroy their ability to resist. This has actually forced them to be resilient and actually become self-sufficient.
It's a forced delinking, practically, right? That's happening there.
Forced delinking, which many Yemenis have advocated needs to be done for years, right? But they've been living under this umbrella of an IMF-induced, World Bank-induced regime that, again, Lebanese know very well what that is all about. And for the future, how Yemenis have been able to arbitrate this exploitation of their dependency on the sea for feeding itself, to actually use this now as a way for them to become self-sufficient again, I think is a working model for the global South. Just like what we're seeing in the Sahel region with Burkina Faso and Mali and Niger. This is something moving forward for Lebanese, for Syrians and others, if there's going to be any hope for Palestine to actually find a way out of this 20th century, 21st century horror show.
Great.
This nightmare. Yemen, again, ironically enough, these cave-dwelling tribal peoples have produced
again
a way...
at the forefront, you're saying. Yeah, I hear you. I think maybe Dina wants to ask you a question, because we reached the point when we want to talk more about your own work historically, right? So I pass it on to Dina.
So Doctor, for me, I just want to ground what you're saying in like practical examples from your scholarship on the Ottoman world. So can you speak on how these maritime corridors in the Ottoman world, whether in the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, or the Eastern Mediterranean, complicated imperial control and created these openings for local actors?
Well, again, we're looking at it, I think we should be looking at it in reverse, that something happens in the 19th century which changes the relationship that people have with the sea in Arabian Peninsula. The whole geographic complex of what maritime trade and more importantly, the connections that the coastal areas have with the hinterland. The whole discussion of the Red Sea littoral, I think, is an important part of the story of the seas, because in the case of Yemen, for instance, it's a mountainous country in the north, which produces much of the food, and it slopes it then down to the Red Sea coastal area, which is largely incapable of sustaining large communities. So Yemen, for example, in many parts of the areas across the Red Sea, in Eritrea, in Somalia, these are all there's a story of the maritime political economy, if you will, but it's very much interconnected with what's happening in the hinterlands. And so the Ottoman Empire's own relationship with Yemen, with the southern Arabian Peninsula, is one that's aggregated and disrupted by political events on the ground. An empire that physically, it is not a 20th century empire, it's an empire that relied on the kinds of exchanges that had to be mediated by local politics, by local self-governance. This is something that we need to highlight. When we talk about the Ottoman Empire, we're not talking about a centralized state regime that operated from Istanbul and disseminated authority, in which people in Yemen or Libya or Algiers or Palestine abided to. No, this was actually an ongoing relationship between indigenous peoples, the peoples who were attracted by the commercial dynamism of these, globally linked societies, and the on and off relationship it had with a sovereign in Istanbul or their representatives in the form of governors. So the politics and the economic dynamics of the Ottoman Empire's frontiers is what I primarily researched, looking comparatively at the Albanian, Montenegrin, Bosnian examples to the far northwest, and Yemen and Kuwait, Basra as examples of the other fringes of the Ottoman Empire. And while there are very different stories developing over the course of the 19th, 18th, and 19th centuries, ending with World War I, that there's one thing that we could actually find comparatively that are similar. That is the fact that these are complex societies that are not, again, dependent on the historical narratives that are often determined by what we read, what's being produced in Istanbul. And so that was one of my tasks, was to somehow bring a dynamism to the frontiers, the fringes of the empire. But in fact, the activism, the dynamics and the needs of a 19th and then early 20th century conglomerate of European Ottoman empires needed to adapt different methods to control the access to the sea, control access to the hinterlands of the sea that are producing the huge potential wealth that it was coveted by London, by investors in Amsterdam, Brussels, and Paris, which was the economic and especially agricultural economic productivity of the peoples of the Ottoman Empire. So whether it be the surplus of wheat that was produced in large amounts in the Balkans, in Syria, in Yemen, whether it was the finished manufactured products that were highly valued in the larger global economy, all these things suddenly became strategically put in new frames by the very fact that the local population were mediators to this new emerging force of capitalism, of especially market-oriented investor capital, finance capitalism. And that kind of relationship will be modified over the course of the beginning of the 19th century, to the extent that there's going to be money for the actual production, the creation of the Suez Canal. That there's going to be a reorientation of what capitalism looks like. Investors who bought into this relationship with India and the Far East, the Dutch and the British in particular, were examples. To now, we need to find new conduits for trade. We're going to have to open up new, say, channels of exchange, which induces investment in new technologies, steamship, the railroads, building canals, and more importantly, then politically controlling the dynamics in these disparate fringe, so-called fringe populations, who actually, like we see today with Ansarullah, can dictate global affairs. Just imagine, while a ballistic missile fired from the mountains of northern Yemen can stop all air transport to Israel, and they can also, with missiles, block all maritime trade with Eilat at least. The similar capacities existed for the peoples of the Red Sea to disrupt any investment that global capitalism put into a new kind of trade between the Mediterranean world, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean world. So that had to be dealt with, addressed. And that's what we would call modern empire. Modern empire that also includes the Ottoman Empire, who becomes a player in Yemen again only in the 1870s because of this dynamic I'm talking about.
After the Tanzimat, I guess. I mean, one of the things that definitely we should have you again on this podcast is to talk to us about the Ottoman Empire in particular, because you definitely are one of the scholars out there who can speak about the empire from margin to margin, right? And one of the questions, I think, building on Dina's question would be, how did you come to Yemen? You know, was Yemen after the Balkans, right? You are a scholar of the Balkans initially, and then you moved to Yemen, right? Was it a margin to margin move? Was it because you realized how central Yemen was? Was it from one trade center, like the Balkans, to the other trade center, like the Yemen of the Ottoman Empire? What was actually, what brought you, what navigated you all the way down to the South Arabian seas and the South Arabian mountains, your own personal trajectory as a scholar?
It started as a human being who was quite adventurous at a young age and traveled through Sudan, through a newly independent country, Eritrea, which went through a horrible 30 years war, and I had politically orientated myself to celebrating in solidarity. And there was this, I went briefly to Djibouti, and there was Yemen, a newly reconfigured conglomerate, unified state. And I took the plunge, flew over, and spent an incredible month and a half in Yemen in 1993. And that, as a human being,
1993, you said, sorry.
Yeah, as a traveler, it said, wow, this is an interesting place, because this is a country that is rapidly transforming. They're going to have elections. And I got the sense of, just by looking at how it was difficult to travel into certain areas and how you had to deal with local communities who were policing their roads and who were basically demanding small taxes for any cars that were traveling on their portion of these very bumpy roads that were going to nowhere. It alerted me to how the capacity of modern states are even limited in 1993, let alone in 2025. The great empire with nuclear power. Israel most likely dropped a small nuclear bomb on Hodeidah last night. We can see images from it.
Wow.
We know that they used a bunker buster,
Like
almost probably
nuclear, you think?
Tactical nuke. They did that in 2016 in trying to break through the mountain in northern Yemen. Even these nuclear powers don't have limited capacities to actually. So that demands a new kind of politics, where in fact you engage in a politics of the local, and I already understood this in 1993. Someone who was studying state formation and urban reforms in Latin America and was very much interested in local politics. In that context, I began to start realizing that, in fact, there's a story to tell about my own part of the world, in the Balkans, but you have to include the dynamism of the Red Sea, and I realized the fringes of the Ottoman Empire is, in fact, telling us a lot about what eventually happens to our world more generally, how we got to this point of this dystopia of a modern surveillance state that's invested in, if necessary, committing genocide, mass murder, which the Europeans will master by the 20th century. Mm-hmm. Europeans kill each other by the hundreds of millions over the course of the 20th century, let alone what they have done in the colonial context, where they've murdered millions of people left and right, north and south. And so Yemen is sadly...
Your travel to Yemen brought to view all of these complex histories and interconnected histories, right? And I think this is where you started writing about the story of the country.
I mean, it alerted me more to the current situation in Yemen, but I became clear more as I looked more into it that I actually had to tell a historical story about it. How did we get to this point? And it became then much more of an investment in writing the history of these seemingly disparate regions or different regions, where in fact there's a lot that they have in common, again, for the impact that they have on what becomes the modern world, the postmodern world. And this is, I think, a lesson for young students, is if you have the means, don't get stuck reading your damn phone. Go out and venture out. Even if it's just...
Tell that to IUB students.
I mean, even if you can't physically leave Beirut, walk around the neighborhoods, look around. I mean, Beirut's such a dynamic city, and that applies to, if you have the opportunity, please don't go to the damn, generic kind of tourist destinations. Go out and venture out and find your story, like I did. That changed my life, my perspective on how human beings have capacity, how the global South, using their access to the sea, And this is, again, why the sea is so important in the capacity of indigenous peoples to resist, and unfortunately how empires have figured out, or at least, and this is what they try to do, is deny us access to the sea, whether it's to feed ourselves, whether it's for us to transit and communicate and trade with others. Obviously, the technology has now moved us beyond being simply dependent on the sea, but the sea is still a tool, even in the 21st century. The Ansar Allah, these so-called backward tribal Iranian proxies, are actually transforming yet again human history. Inshallah, they will actually be able to, their interventions will actually end this horror show. But what it does, I hope, if we can actually, through your podcasts or others, provide a kind of a guidebook, if you will, for how indigenous peoples who have more or less given up, or who have resigned to being tools and victims, to actually being proactive again. Because I think
that's one of the aims. Yeah. So how do you see the future? Because I hear you being optimistic about a bit. No, you're not optimistic. There are some optimistic sides or cracks of optimism.
Well, I know that as indigenous peoples, whether it be in the Balkans, whether it be in South Arabia, Central Africa, that there is capacity. There still is. Now, whether or not we are able to drum up that capacity is another thing. I think what's happening in northern Yemen is quite unique. It can spur and encourage others to mobilize in similar terms. We did have that spirited kind of collective, what is required is collective collaboration in some pockets in South Lebanon during certain moments in time, but the encouragements and the opportunities to destroy those coalitions are ever present. And this is why I'm very frustrated and not so optimistic.
Not so optimistic.
I mean,
because I heard some optimism in there, but yeah okay.
No, there is opportunities that we shouldn't surrender.
I mean, how can one be optimistic and miss a genocide? Of course, yeah, absolutely.
And we do see that people do have capacities, but we actually have to work towards that. And Ansar Allah is facing enormous pressure, not only the violent use of bombs, small tactical nuclear weapons, for goodness sake, but also within and around them. They are completely under siege right now, just like our brothers and sisters in Gaza. And just like our brothers and sisters in Gaza, they have been betrayed by people who at one point claimed solidarity, or at one point claimed brotherhood and sisterhood. And we need to address that as well.
I think Dina might have a question about that, right? Because we are also nearing the end, but I think that's an important question.
I just, for me, I just want to ask you about this idea that, of course, the economic punishment is horrible, but how can we begin to tell the story of the Yemenis and their armed forces right now without speaking about the proxy relationship and the relationship with Iran? I mean, what we're saying is very important, but how can we reconcile that, without completely pushing it to the side?
Well, you have to push it aside because practically there was no collaboration. Yemenis were entirely surrounded by this embargo. Who, if you look at a map of where Ansar Allah has formal authority, which in itself needs to be challenged, how we talk about Ansar Allah's authority over these territories, but where are ballistic missiles going to be coming from? They have to produce their own ballistic missiles. They're not going to be driven from Saudi Arabia. They're not going to be driven from UAE-controlled parts of southern Yemen. They're not going to be coming through a ship that has to go through Djibouti under quarantine and inspected before it's allowed to actually get into this corridor of Hudaydah. So there's no air traffic. There are no planes delivering supplies to northern Yemen since 2015. Now, what they do have, however, is a legacy. They have the legacy of a very advanced military created under Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was an ally of the United States in those days. who built a Republican Guard that actually was trained, ironically enough, by the British and the Americans, who had the engineering capacities. They had Scud missiles already inherited from the late 1980s. But most importantly, they are patriots. And they will not subscribe to becoming basically tools to destroy their own military, as we're seeing in Syria right now, for instance, where they've just stepped aside and allowed for whatever existed of the Syrian military capacity to resist Israel has been blown up and has been handed over for permanently disabling the ability to resist from Syria. So in Yemen, they did not do that. So the constant reference to the Iranians is a way for us to delegitimize what is very much an indigenous effort and out of necessity. Iran was, before 2014, they were not supplying weapons to the Yemeni army. The Yemeni army was firmly under the oversight of the American embassy. So my question is, logistically, it is impossible to sneak in all of this technology, let alone manufacture it. So they are manufacturing these missiles deep down inside these mountains, which cannot be penetrated. You can blow it up the top of the mountain as much as you want, but Yemenis for a long time have built that capacity to have in the mountains factories where they can keep their missiles, produce their missiles, and they reverse engineer, and all these brilliant young people who can learn things by just looking at the internet and finding the way to engineer these things, and they find out ways to do it themselves. They've done it themselves. And it's a disservice to people of the global south to keep evoking some connection that Zaidis have with 12er Shia Iran, which has, again, very complicated politics over the last 30 years. And if I may interject, Iran right now is not invested in supporting resistance. They have demonstrated over and over again that they will exploit their associations with Yemen, even though they don't have any, to have leverage at the diplomatic level in discussing other things. And Yemenis have been very clear in their public statements, if they're ever allowed to actually articulate those public statements. Do not link us to Iran. We have nothing to do with Iran. Iran is not here fighting this war against the Americans, the British, the Saudi, Qatari, Emirati coalitions, let alone Israel today. We are the ones dying. We're the ones who are building this infrastructure. We're the ones who have decided when and where our capacities are going to be used. And I think we have to respect that. It's a disservice to the people of the global south if we continuously play to the rhetorical games who call us tribal peoples as opposed to political constituencies. That's how I talk about tribes. I call them constituencies. Let's use the terminology we use about how we use and talk about our own world and apply it to everywhere else. I refuse to call them pirates. I call them enforcers of territorial sovereign rights. Somalis, when they stop ships dumping their toxic waste, or the fishing trawlers from Spain or China, they're taking all the fish away from their coastal areas. When they interject and intervene, they're protecting their sovereign maritime borders. And that's how we should be treating our relationship historically with this capitalist enterprise that has co-opted and kidnapped how we talk about history, how we talk about ourselves. And I think that would be a way moving forward, that Ansar Allah is not a proxy to the enemies of the United States. It is not a servant of other people's interests. It is on principle dying to defend Gaza and the people of Gaza. And we should give them at least that dignity, because they've made that choice and they're doing it where many, many other people's much better capable of doing that are not doing that. And
that's a powerful way of putting it, Isa. And I also thank you very much for bringing up the piracy issue in Somalia, and you also make the connections between what the Yemenis actually believe, and we should definitely also give them this dignity, as you said, to recognize this, to acknowledge this, and to believe their words, and not necessarily putting other words in their mouths. Amazing. I think you should definitely come back to this podcast. I'm sure that hopefully we're going to have the option to revisit another part of your vast knowledge. Next time, I hope to see also, and I'm sure you're going to see also this intimidating library back on your shelves. I mean, you are one of the persons that has one of the most intimidating libraries I've ever met, and I think it's also wonderful your ability to be able to deliver all this knowledge to us. We have to cut it. I think it's time to make a pause here. I don't say we cut it. I think we just pause for now with Aisa, and hopefully we're going to have you on another show soon. We're going to continue our series of investigations and or discussions with about the sea with others who also work on issues of Palestine solidarity in the next 2 or 3 episodes, and I hope to have you again. Aisa, thank you so much for being with us today, and hope to see you again very, very soon in person, also in Beirut, that I know you love very much, and Beirut loves you back. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dina, for your help and for your support. Thank you, Rua. She's behind the camera, as many others in the room. It's also intimidating to be in this room with so many other people, thinking that we do something important. We do believe that we do hope to have contributed to this very important discussion out there, which, as Aisa Blumi told us very eloquently today, is unfortunately not given its right dimensions, right? The right dimension, the right also depth. Thank you so much, and hope to see you soon.
Inshallah.
On a, with us. Take care.
Yeah. Bye-bye.